You are looking at the future of baseball. Yes, this random breaking ball at the top of the strike zone for a called strike doesn't look innovative at all. But because we exist in this very special moment in time where the challenge system is coming into play next year and pitchers are throwing breaking balls more than ever, that very dumb pitch might become a lot more popular in MLB. Now, you may not believe it, but umpires are more accurate than they've ever been. It's very subtle, yes, but 5 years ago, umps were missing about 29,000 calls a season, right around 4% of all called strikes or balls in a given game. And this season, they're at a historically low 26,000 missed calls. This is partially due to the league adjusting how umpires are graded in anticipation of the challenge system that we will have next year. AKA, I don't think they wanted their umpires to get a bunch of those calls overturned when the challenge system is upon us. But despite this improvement, there's a particular part of the strike zone that umpires are the least accurate in. It's at the top of the strike zone, particularly on breaking pitches. If you just look at breaking balls that land in the upper third of the strike zone, they're inaccurately called about 9% of the time, so almost 1 in every 10. But I want to get super specific here to illustrate those pitches that just clip the top of the strike zone. So let's focus on pitches one ball on the plate from the top of the strike zone. We'll call this the upper shadow. This season, when a breaking ball landed in the upper shadow, umpires missed about 1 in every 5 calls. For comparison, if the pitch was a fastball and landed in this upper shadow, umps were missing closer to 1 in every 10 calls. Move to the bottom of the strike zone, so we can call this the lower shadow, and breaking balls in the zone were called incorrectly, more like 1 in every 20 pitches. So you can see here, umps have some trouble with balls that break into the strike zone, especially at the top of the zone. I really like these umpire cams that they've used a lot this postseason. The quality has improved on them to the point where you can actually see pitch trajectory pretty well. I wasn't a high-level hitter at all in my youth, but from talking to folks who are, or at least talking to those who have trained high-level hitters, the initial trajectory of a pitch likely has some implication on swing or take decisions made by a hitter. For example, watch how this Tarek Skubal slider feels like it's moving up out of the zone, and then by the time you're past the decision point of a swing, it's breaking back in, and at that point, it's too late and you get a called strike. So it's really the trajectory of these pitches that I think maybe fools the umpires to some extent, and a lot of the time hitters as well. So in theory, with a challenge system, these kinds of pitches, these breaking balls clipping the top of the zone, are the ones that are called inaccurately the most frequently, and therefore perhaps they're the ones that pitchers will try to challenge. But why would pitchers even want to throw these pitches in the first place? One of the drawbacks of this pitch is a simple one. Pitches generally miss in the direction of their break. So if you're a left-handed pitcher throwing to a right-handed hitter, and you're throwing a four-seam fastball perfectly down the middle of the plate, your actual location is likely to be somewhere up over here in the strike zone, up away from the right-handed hitter. This is because four-seamers tend to move up into the pitcher's left or arm side. This is the way we measure movement on pitch plots that you see on Baseball Savant right here. Now think back to our idea that you want a called strike with your breaking ball at the top of the strike zone. In order to do that, you need to aim probably up here. And as you could probably guess, breaking balls break down. So the natural miss is going to be into a very dangerous area, the heart of the strike zone, where nearly 70% of balls hit for home runs this past season were located. As with most decisions that pitchers have to make, there's a risk and a reward. So the risk is that you give up a barrel, but the reward is that on these pitches that are breaking into the top of the strike zone, the swing rate is very, very low. Fastballs thrown in the first or second pitch of an at-bat that were located at the top of the zone in 2025 generated a swing rate of 60%, with an expected slug around 585 when contact was made. Breaking balls induced a swing nearly half as often, only about 32% of the time, with an expected slug about 10 points lower. And if you want to get really specific, curveballs located up in the zone generated just an 18% swing rate, insanely low relative to other shapes. Being able to generate a called strike without massive risk for damage and push yourself from an 0-0 to an 0-1 or a 1-1 to a 1-2 count is a huge advantage. Ben Clemens of Fangraphs wrote a piece back in 2020 that I love. He looked at hitter performance after an at-bat had reached a certain count, but look specifically at the hitter's performance relative to themselves instead of just zooming out and looking at league averages. He found that after an 0-1 count, you perform about 16% worse than you normally would from a weighted on base average standpoint. And after a 1-0 count, you're about 13% better. That's a 29 percentage point swing. That is pretty darn big. But 1-1 spots are even more important. Go to 1-2 and you'll perform about 30% worse than your average, but get to a 2-1 and you're 13% better than your average. So that 29 percentage point gap from 0-0 situations increases to a 43 point swing when you're 1-1. Needless to say, count leverage matters a ton, and in talking to people around the sport as to whether the strategy of just trying to steal strikes at the top of the zone with breaking balls could actually be viable or scalable to some extent within an organization, the continual answer I got is that these orgs would just be playing the called strike game, which is essentially a cheat way to try to get count leverage back in the pitcher's favor. And you'll be somewhat unsurprised to find out that the team that kind of seems to be adopting this strategy is none other than the Tampa Bay Rays. In 2025, the Rays threw the largest percent of their breaking balls at the top of the strike zone. 15% of their breakers this season were located at the top of the zone. Now, I'm subtly changing the definition of top here to this trapezoid shape on Baseball Savant's attack zones, but again, the idea stands no matter which way you define the top. And that 15% number is nearly double the league average of about 8%. In two strike situations as well, they jump even higher relative to the average, throwing 12% of their breaking balls up, while the league average is under 6%. So the question here is whether it's intentional with the Rays. Are they telling their pitchers to try to gain back count leverage by throwing breaking balls at the top of the strike zone? Now, this is an impossibly hard thing to prove because the Rays are never going to tell us. No team ever tells us their pitching strategies. But there was, in fact, a rumor floating around one team this year that the Rays, yes, were trying to basically gamify this count leverage element and get an edge for their pitchers by spamming breaking balls and slider shapes at the top of the strike zone where they knew swing rates were lower for hitters, and they were mostly willing to accept the risk of loss by that ball drifting back into the middle of the zone and them giving up damage. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this was an intentional thing by the Rays, and again, it's going to be hard to prove, but my approach to this would be putting it on a probability scale. I think for the most part, I would say I'm 60% confident this was something the Rays were trying to gain an edge on. The other 40% I'm going to reserve for more of like a residual effect off something that we'll go over right now. So it's related to the Rays' approach as a whole from a pitching standpoint. They employ a pretty aggressive centralized targets strategy before two strikes. So for a lot of these pitches that fit our breaking balls up category, it doesn't necessarily look like the Rays pitcher is hunting a called strike up in the zone. Perhaps they're looking at the catcher's mask instead of the catcher's glove when the concept is something like, hey, grab a strike here. So the pitcher visual would change, but not the catcher's target. The other alternative is that the Rays throw a bunch of these short, tight sliders, and these sliders don't move much in the concept of short form movement, which I showed on our pitch plots, such that if we're trying to figure out which direction they miss, if you're aiming perfectly middle, it's likely down, but the harder these pitches get, the more behind the ball you are, and the higher probability that the pitch misses up right into our upper shadow of the strike zone. Another individual I spoke with in a major league organization about this idea was a bit spooked off by the risk of loss here. So they were totally aware that the called strike rate at the top of the zone was far higher on some of these breaking balls compared to a fastball. But when you start to look at something like expected run value, so thinking about everything that a pitch can do to move you to different count states as opposed to purely thinking about the expected slug allowed, what you start to see is that, yeah, fastballs maybe do have a subtle advantage there overall. But again, as with anything in baseball, I do think it's a lot about the buy-in that a team might have overall. And the Rays are maybe in this very narrow area where they have one of the best pitching coaches in all of baseball in Kyle Snyder. And they have really good integration from R&D down to field and from the major league level all the way through the minors as well. We see this with their centralized targeting strategy. So perhaps it's like an aligning of the stars where there aren't a lot of other teams that could do this apart from the Rays. There is, however, a figurehead of this strategy, and it's not a pitcher on the Rays. In fact, it's probably a pitcher you've never heard of. His name is Dalton Rogers of the Red Sox. He was a 2022 third rounder out of Southern Mississippi. He pitched for AA affiliate Portland this most recent season, and he has the funniest slider location of all time. Take a look. The first 15 times I saw this heat map here, I needed to make sure that I wasn't actually looking at his four-seam fastball location. And in fact, I was not. This is his slider location. He does this breaking balls up thing. It's a called strike strategy and it works pretty well for him. The swing rate on his slider is lower than 94% of other sliders thrown in the minor leagues this season. And he has a decent expected run value on the pitch as well. He is our guy, and let me tell you, I cannot wait to see him eventually debut in the major leagues. So I think the ultimate takeaway from this video is pretty layered, but I'd say it comes down to two things. One of which I don't even think I mentioned when talking about the advantages of throwing these breaking balls up in the zone. But apart from the called strike angle, what teams are trying to do is not throw fastballs in early count situations, but again, also get strikes on hitters such that you don't run into those count leverage problems. So this idea of throwing breaking balls early count situations, trying to steal strikes, allows you to not show your fastball early such that it then decays quicker, which is a concept I've done some videos on overall. So that's the main takeaway. The second takeaway layers back in the challenge system, which we will see next year. And I'll admit, I could probably do an entirely different video on whether these pitches are even worth it to challenge, especially if it's not in a situation where, you know, it's a leverage moment or a 1-1 game and etc. What you want to challenge from an ABS standpoint overall is a great question. I'm not entirely sure there's an optimal answer. I imagine catchers a lot of the time will be the ones challenging pitches because they in spring training were the ones that were called as the most accurate in terms of their overturn rate. But perhaps we see other elements of this that start to trickle out and we see some tendencies among the smarter teams. So these could be the pitches that pitchers want to challenge a lot. Perhaps they present the most opportunity to be challenged, but as to whether they are challenged when we get this in 2026 remains to be seen. So a lot of layers to this idea, some fun stuff I think to think through, and of course I always want your thoughts. So if you hop into the comments, I'm usually down there as much as I can to try to talk with people. A lot of the time we get a lot of comments, more than I expect honestly, so I'm not able to keep up with it, but I imagine you see the likes, you see the other engagement, so it's cool to have kind of a small community of people down in the comments that share the love for baseball and baseball analytics like myself. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.